August 8th, 1991. It's the eve of Singapore's National Day. Across the city, preparations for the celebration were everywhere. Streets were lined with red and white flags. Banners hung from HDB windows. Families were getting ready for the next day's festivities, the annual celebration of the nation's independence. For most Singaporeans, it was a moment of pride. Another year marking how far the young country had come. But somewhere in the city, a man's evening was about to change. A Singaporean reservist, an NS man in the Singapore Armed Forces, was at home with his family, expecting a quiet night before the holiday. Then his phone rang. He picked it up, listened, said nothing. When the call ended, he walked silently to his room. Inside the drawer was something he hadn't touched in months: his uniform, and beside it, his boots. He had just been called up, quietly, secretly, on Singapore's most celebrated day of the year. And he wasn't the only one. Across the island, hundreds of reservists were receiving the same call. There were no public announcements, no breaking news. The Ministry of Defense had triggered a quiet mobilization. The men answering these calls were not soldiers waiting in barracks. They were accountants, engineers, teachers, shopkeepers, men who had completed their national service years earlier and returned to civilian life, kept their reservist duties quietly in the background, a responsibility they hoped they would never need again. But that night, they did. And as Singapore slept that night, its military was quietly preparing for something far more serious. Because 20 kilometers away, across the border in southern Malaysia, something unusual was about to take place. A massive joint military exercise between Malaysia and Indonesia. Thousands of troops, armored vehicles, heavy artillery, airborne paratroopers. Its code name was chilling, Pukul Habis. In Malay, it means total wipeout. And its most dramatic phase, a full airborne assault, was scheduled for the next morning, August 9th, the very day Singapore celebrates its independence. To understand why those reservists picked up their phones without hesitation, we have to go back further, much further. March 10th, 1965. It's a Tuesday morning. Orchard Road, Singapore. McDonald House, a busy commercial building in the heart of the city. At 3:07 in the afternoon, a bomb explodes inside the building. 3 people are killed. 33 are injured. The attack was not carried out by a criminal gang or a lone radical. It was carried out by Indonesian military operatives, agents of a state-sponsored sabotage campaign known as Konfrontasi. Indonesia, under President Sukarno, had launched a covert war against Malaysia and Singapore. Bombings, assassinations, sabotage raids. Singapore, barely a city, barely a country, had already become a target. 5 months later, on August 9th, 1965, Singapore was expelled from the Malaysian Federation. Overnight, it became an independent nation. 580 square kilometers, no army, no natural resources, no strategic depth. Surrounded by countries far larger than itself, including the same country whose agents had just bombed its streets. To the north, Malaysia, the federation it had just separated from. Relations were tense, complicated, and deeply personal. To the south, Indonesia, a nation of 200 million people, one of the largest militaries in Southeast Asia, and a recent history of viewing Singapore as a problem to be managed. Singapore's first Prime Minister, Kuan reportedly wept on television when he announced independence, because he understood, better than anyone, what this tiny island was up against. From day one, Singapore's survival strategy was built around a single idea. If you cannot be too large to attack, be too painful to swallow. In 1967, Singapore introduced mandatory national service. Every young man would serve. Every neighborhood would have soldiers. Defense became the responsibility of the entire nation, shaped by memories of attacks like the McDonald House bombing. But that was just the foundation. Over the following decades, Singapore transformed its military. It invested heavily in defense, acquiring advanced fighter jets, building a modern navy, developing precision artillery, and training its forces to some of the highest standards in the region. Officers studied military strategy abroad. The SAF ran simulations, war games, and constant planning. By the 1980s, defense analysts across the region had started paying attention. This was not a symbolic army. Singapore had built a force that would cause genuine, lasting damage to anyone who tried to take it by force. Military strategists called it the porcupine doctrine. You cannot eat a porcupine without being hurt. The goal was simple: deterrence, not confrontation. Peace, in Singapore's view, is not something that happens. It's something you build and maintain by force. By 1991, that force was ready. To understand the Pukul Habis incident, we need to understand the diplomatic climate in 1991. Singapore's relationship with Malaysia had never been simple. The two countries shared a border, a history, a language, and a set of grievances that stretched back decades. Water agreements, land disputes, railway rights, and the lingering sting of a separation that both sides still felt differently about. In the years leading up to 1991, tensions had periodically flared. There were disputes over the terms of water supply agreements, disputes over airspace, disputes over how Singapore's military is trained and where. Singapore had also been deepening its defense relationships with countries that its neighbors viewed with suspicion, most notably Israel, which had sent military advisors to help build the SAF in its earliest years. And then there was the broader question of power. Singapore was small, but it was becoming undeniably, uncomfortably capable. Its economy was growing fast. Its military was growing faster. And there is always a moment when a small neighbor's success begins to feel like a statement. Against this backdrop, Malaysia and Indonesia announced a joint military exercise in southern Johor, the Malaysian state that borders Singapore. The location was not random. Kota Tinggi, where the exercise was based, sits close enough to the border that aircraft launched from there could reach Singapore in minutes. The exercise was large: thousands of troops, armored columns, heavy artillery, and crucially, an airborne assault phase. Paratroopers jumping from aircraft and landing in a simulated combat zone. The code name they chose was Pukul Habis, means total wipeout, and they scheduled its peak phase, the airborne assault, for August 9th, National Day, the day Singapore marks its survival. Whether it was deliberate or not, the message was received. What they didn't know was that Singapore had been watching the situation carefully. Long before the joint exercise began, Singapore already knew what was coming and had quietly begun preparing. Weeks before the exercise began, Singapore's intelligence services had already identified that something unusual was about to take place near its borders. The military command knew the code name, they knew the scale, they knew the date, and they made a decision. They would not cancel National Day. They would not make a public statement. They would not tip their hand. Instead, quietly, invisibly, they activated a shadow response. Reservists across the island were contacted through official channels, not loudly, not in a way that would cause alarm or reach the press. They were simply called, and they answered. Units were placed on standby. The equipment was prepared. Ammunition was distributed. Then came August 9th. Singapore woke up to celebration. Families gathered in parks and gardens. Children painted their faces red and white. Flags waved from balconies and HDB windows. The National Day parade began. Stadiums filled with crowds singing national songs as fighter jets roared overhead, tracing patterns across the sky. It looked like a perfect celebration, but beyond the island, across the border, the military exercise was reaching its peak. The paratroopers eventually jumped. The operation unfolded as planned, and Singapore watched, ready and silent. Hour by hour, the day passed. The parade ended. The crowds returned home, and across the border, the exercise concluded. The troops packed up. The paratroopers went home. No war came. Officially, Pukul Habis was described as routine military training between two allied nations. Standard cooperation, nothing to read into. And maybe that's true. Military exercises follow their own planning cycles. Dates get set months in advance. Code names are sometimes chosen without thinking about how they land. Maybe August 9th was simply the date the logistics worked out. But Kuan didn't think so. In his later accounts of the episode, Singapore's founding prime minister was characteristically blunt. He described the exercise as an attempt to intimidate Singapore, a show of force designed to remind the young city-state of its vulnerability. If that was the intention, it failed, because Singapore had done exactly what its entire defense doctrine was built to do. It had seen the threat coming. It had prepared without showing its hand, and it had demonstrated to itself, if not publicly, that it could mobilize its citizen army on its most celebratory day and keep the country calm at the same time. In the decades since, Singapore has continued to invest heavily in its military. It remains one of the most capable armed forces in Southeast Asia, and arguably in in the world relative to its size. National service continues. The reservist system continues. The doctrine of deterrence continues. Relations with Malaysia and Indonesia have improved significantly. The three countries are partners today in ways they weren't in 1991. Trade, diplomacy, and regional institutions have changed the neighborhood. But the memory of Pukul Habis has not been forgotten inside Singapore's defense establishment, because it proved something Singapore had long believed. Peace is protected by deterrence.